Welcome everyone. We're at the half hour, so we'll go ahead and get started with our webinar today. Thank you for joining us for our webinar on a review of the ISO IEC 17065 draft standard. I'm Melanie Ross and I will be your facilitator today. Please note that we are recording this webinar for viewing in the future. A few logistics before we get started. All attendees are muted throughout the webinar. We do have the option for you to submit your questions via the Q&A box under the chat panel. We've planned time at the end of the webinar to review the questions that you may have. Our presenter today is Keith Mowry. Keith is the Senior Manager of Business Development at ANAB. He is ANAB's representative on the ANSI International Conformity Assessment Committee, or ICAC, the National Mirror Committee to ISO CASCO. He's served as ICAC chair for over 20 years and has over 30 years of experience with ISO standards and guides for conformity assessment. With that, I'm going to pass the ball to Keith, so he now will be able to present.
Thank you excuse me, everybody. Thanks so much, Melanie. Hi to everybody. I hope you're having a good afternoon. Melanie, we lost the slides on the screen, I think. Is there any way we could get those back up? There we go. All right, we're off to a rollicking good start then.
Yes, let me know when you want me to change the slide and I will click the forward button.
Okay. So everybody, today we're going to talk about the draft amendment to ISO IEC 17065. And of course, 17065 is the ISO CASCO standard, CASCO being the committee in ISO that writes standards for conformity assessment bodies and so forth. It's the ISO CASCO standard that sets requirements, competence, consistency, and impartiality requirements for bodies that perform product, process, and service certification. And so how did we get to a position today where we're going to talk about a draft amendment? Well, we're going to roll the clock back just a little bit, about a year or so, and kind of walk through the events that led us up to where we are now. As many of you probably know, when an ISO CASCO, or any ISO standard for that matter, has not been revised for a period of 5 years, it automatically undergoes what's called a systematic review ballot. And that's a ballot that goes out to the committee responsible for the standard, or subcommittee. But here at ISO CASCO, that would be the full ISO CASCO committee that gets the ballot. And the ballot asks the members to confirm the standard, continue to publish it as it is, to revise it, that means open up the entire document for revision, to withdraw the document, no longer needed, we don't need to publish this anymore, and if there's no consensus or the member doesn't have a particular point of view, then they can abstain. And so we had one of these systematic review ballots for 17065 back in 2024, and it was interesting to note that up until that ballot, in the history of CASCO, which has been writing standards for about 25 years now, there had never been a standard that was 10 years old or older that had been confirmed on a systematic review ballot. Every single time that an older standard like that came up, it was always voted to be revised. Never voted to be withdrawn, but revised. Now, when the systematic review ballot goes out, it goes out to the entire, all the member bodies of ISO CASCO. And because CASCO has no standing subcommittees, each individual systematic review ballot gets sent to the entire national committee of each member. And so, presumably, at the national member level, all the different interested parties have a chance to say whether the standard should be confirmed, revised, or withdrawn. Now, the results of that systematic review ballot were very interesting. At least I thought they were interesting. The first most interesting thing we see here is that the vote was to confirm. So here was a 12-year-old standard, 17065, and for the first time ever, a standard that old, the members voted by simple majority to confirm the standard, not open it up for revision. You can see it was kind of close, right? 35 versus 32, and you know, there were 23 member bodies to CASCO that didn't vote, either confirm or revise. They abstained. 8 because they couldn't achieve consensus, and 15 because they apparently don't use the standard and so felt they shouldn't, you know, say one way or the other. There were only 2 member bodies that didn't vote at all. Now, I broke apart the ballot because I thought it might be interesting. Thinking about all my years of activity at ISO CASCO, I thought, you know, I wonder what the vote looked like among the member bodies in Europe, US, Canada, Japan, China, Australia, and India. Many, many, many years ago, when I started to get involved with ISO CASCO, those seemed to be the member bodies that tended to be more active. Of course, things have changed over time. But I just thought, nah, I wonder what those folks thought. And here we see that in that group of member bodies, the vote was a strong majority to actually revise the document. However, for all the other members of CASCO outside those countries, there was a stronger majority to confirm. So what that told me was that 17065 is being used pretty extensively in many, many, many different places. And overall, of all the places it's being used, it was apparently people wanted to see it continue on and not have it undergo a revision. So that means we're going to continue to publish 17065 2012, and we'll all continue to use it and go on our merry way. However, that doesn't mean that there aren't any issues that are pertinent regarding 17065. And the next systematic review would not be until 2029, because it's that 5-year cycle. But of course, if there was a proposal to revise the standard prior to 2029, well, then that proposal would be taken up. We wouldn't wait till 2029 to think about revisions. But thinking about that next 5-year cycle, that seems, you know, there are still some things that maybe are worth thinking about, right, in 17065. And those are, first, the fact that ISO IEC 17000 was revised in 2020. And some of the terms and definitions in 17065 don't match the definitions in the new version of 17000, right? And so, you know, maybe that's something to be concerned about. Then a number of documents that are referenced in the published 17065 have actually been withdrawn. Some have been replaced, but some have just been withdrawn and not even replaced. And so for a reader of 17065, you know, especially a new reader of 17065, that's not really ideal to be pointing somebody newer to 17065 to a guidance document that they won't be able to find and doesn't even exist anymore. So, you know, the conclusion is, well, is there a way to kind of address these, if you will, minor changes or these issues with 17065, respecting the majority of the CASCO member bodies that voted to confirm it, but to maybe, you know, tweak it up a little bit regarding these particular issues? And lo and behold, there is a path toward that, and the ISO directives, the rules for how ISO standards are developed, the ISO directives give us a path to do that. They give us an answer. Specifically, in the ISO directives part 1, in clause 2.10.3, we read about amendments. And so an amendment per the directives alters the technical provisions of an ISO standard, right? But an amendment is considered a partial revision. The rest of the international standard is not open for comments. And well, what does this mean? What do you mean by the rest of the international standard? That's not, well, as it turns out, when an amendment is proposed for an ISO standard, the proposal has to explicitly describe what in the standard is going to be considered for change. And so if an amendment proposal is adopted, then the subsequent work is only allowed to address those specific items that the amendment proposal identified. And that's what the directives mean when they say the rest of the international standard is not open for comments. If it wasn't brought up in the amendment proposal, then the subsequent work can't touch it. And that's just the way the directives are written. So in light of 17065, after this systematic review, here in the US, there was a proposal developed to amend 17065, which did lay out the specific areas of 17065 to change, and that was submitted to the National Mirror Committee here in the United States, which is run by ANSI, the American National Standards Institute. And within that ANSI Mirror Committee to CASCO, that proposal received a unanimous approval. Everybody thought that was a good idea. And so that proposal was forwarded on to the CASCO Secretariat for an amendment to 17065. The Secretariat at CASCO then balloted that proposal for an amendment to 17065 to all the CASCO member bodies. And interestingly, you know, this was relatively soon after that systematic 5-year review ballot. So that was kind of out of the ordinary because, you know, you don't usually think about an amendment coming close on the heels of a systematic review. And so here on this slide, we see the results of the amendment ballot. And I think these are interesting to contrast the vote here with the vote on the systematic review, because the vote here was quite a larger and stronger majority to approve this detailed amendment proposal. You can see the 58-14 vote to approve was quite a bit stronger than the 35-32 on the systematic review ballot. And we see that in both the regions inside Europe, US, Canada, Japan, etc., inside those member bodies, there was a very strong majority to approve the amendment proposal, as well as outside that. So really an even stronger majority outside of the Europe, US, Canada, Japan, etc. regions was to approve. But the key takeaway here is, while it was a very close majority that said, let's confirm the document, there did seem to be a very strong sentiment about an amendment. And so that ballot passed. The ballot that proposed this amendment passed and is creating a series of firsts within ISO CASCO. This was the very first time an amendment had been proposed to ISO CASCO. ISO CASCO has never done an amendment before to one of their documents. Consequently, this ballot to propose the amendment that got issued and was approved by the majority we looked at there, that was the very first ballot of a proposed amendment to ISO CASCO. And the recently completed draft amendment for the amendment to 17065, what we're going to talk about today, that was the first time that CASCO members had even seen an amendment ballot, a proposed amendment itself, and let alone voted on it. And so at the end of this process, when this amendment gets published, this amendment to 17065 will be another first. It'll be the first published amendment to an ISO CASCO standard. So let's now talk about what's changing. What did the draft amendment talk about, and what has happened, and where are we now in the process? So there are basically 3 types of changes that the amendment proposal outlined, and these are the changes that the draft amendment can make to 17065. And outside of these 3 types of changes, changes to 17065 are not allowed. So the first type of change that the amendment proposal talked about were changing references to other documents in 17065. So for example, 17065 references ISO IEC 17000 2004, and that's going to be replaced by a reference to the current version of 17000. Likewise, 17065 refers to the older version of ISO IEC 17021, but that's been replaced by ISO IEC 17021-1. So those are references that will be updated as a result of this amendment. Then we have some ISO guides, 23, 27, 28, and 53. Those are referenced in 17065, but they don't exist anymore. And it would be very difficult, and for some impossible, especially new readers, to try to understand what those were and where they could probably find an old copy of them if those references stayed in 17065. So those are going to be taken out, because those are not relevant documents anymore since they're out of publication. However, we do have the opportunity, and the draft amendment says, but wait, we have new documents that are pertinent and helpful. Let's add those in. And so we have these technical reports, the ISO IEC technical reports, these three at the bottom in the third bullet, and those are certainly pertinent to product certification. They give examples of different types of product, process, and service certification. And so those are going to be added in because they didn't exist in 2012, but they exist now. And, readers should know about them because they're going to get helpful content there. So that was the first kind of change, reference documents. Now, the second type of change is terms and definitions. Now, I noted that we're going to be changing the normative reference to ISO IEC 17000:2020, but in addition to that, we're also going to be revising the definitions themselves in 17065. When I say we, I mean the working group. I sit on the working group that's doing the work, and the reason we're doing this is because that's what the draft amendment proposal told us to do. And that's the proposal that was approved by the CASCO members. So that's what's driving these different things that we're changing. So, some people would say, oh, well, they're just terms and definitions. And so, what's kind of the big deal about that? But they are important, okay? And for one of the first reasons they're important is because, as we all know, like all standards, 17065 is often referenced as a part of a contract, or referenced by a regulation or a piece of legislation, right? And that's the way 17065 becomes kind of alive, if you will, as requirements that have to be met. Some vehicle like a contract or a law or a regulation imposes 17065 requirements as mandatory. Otherwise, without that kind of a vehicle, then 17065, might be adopted by a certification body for its own use, and they might voluntarily meet those requirements. But there's no external vehicle that makes it really a condition of doing business or a condition of fulfilling the law, for example. And so, because in effect 17065 often becomes a part of a contract or a law or a regulation, that all of a sudden makes the terminology very important. Everybody wants to know very clearly what their obligations are and are not, and everybody wants to be able to see and understand those obligations in a consistent way. So these definitions are needed for consistent, clear, and unambiguous contracts and legislation and regulation. In addition, other ISO CASCO standards are being updated, being open for revision, for the whole document to be revised. And in the course of those revisions, the terminology in those standards is being updated to match ISO IEC 17000:2020. Well, we don't want 17065 to be kind of lagging behind that. We don't want 17065 to be out of step with other ISO CASCO standards, the terminology. We want the terminology to be consistent among all these standards. So the draft amendment proposal said, yes, we're going to change terms and definitions to update them. And so because the proposal told us to do that, now the working group is certainly working on that. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about these terms and definitions in two aspects of them in particular. And the first is the term certification scheme. And this is a brand new definition and term. I think it's a new term in 17065, but the key thing here is that we're going to have a definition of certification scheme that is built on and parallels the definition of scheme in ISO IEC 17000. So in the context of 17065, a certification scheme, as the draft amendment that was balloted shows us, it said it's a set of rules and procedures that describes the object of conformity, identifies the specified requirements, and provides the methodology for performing certification and related activities. Now, you can see that this is close, not quite exact, but close to an exact duplicate of the definition of scheme in 17,000. It's tweaked up just a little bit to make it, particularly in the last line there, relevant and specific to product, process, and service certification. So within our context of 17065, the object of conformity is clearly the product, process, or service that's being certified. And the specified requirements are the requirements that the product, process, or service has to fulfill in order to be certified. And then the methodology for performing certification and related activities, that's all the step-by-step instructions for all the different activities that everyone's going to do to carry out a complete demonstration that results in certification. When certification per 17,000 is an action, it's the action of issuing a statement of conformity. And so this is how a simple definition in 17065 brings up to date the 17065 linkage with 17,020, and also helps make 17065 consistent with other ISO CASCO standards. Now, the reason I highlight certification scheme is because we all know there are so many references to scheme in 17065. And we could talk about that in a whole separate webinar as the reason why and the impacts of that. But it makes the term certification scheme that much more critical. And then the second aspect I'd like to mention is that we're trying to make changes in 17065 through the draft amendment so that when we talk about the content of schemes, we talk about rules and procedures. Because per the definition, that's what a scheme is comprised of. It's comprised of a set of rules and procedures. So to try to be clear to the reader, when we want to refer to something that's part of the content of a scheme in 17065, we're going to call it a rule or a procedure or a set of or a group of rules and procedures. When we want to refer to the specified requirements that certified products, processes, and services have to meet, then that's when in 17065 we want to consistently use the word requirements. And we don't want to mix up the two, because we want to try to make it as clear as possible when the 17065 document is talking about the rules and procedures in a scheme versus when it's talking about the specified requirements that a certified product, process, or service has to meet. Now, another change in terms and definitions is this term third party. The term third party is not actually defined in ISO IEC 17000. It is only used as a descriptor for a type of activity. There's one definition in 17,000, and that's for third-party activity. And so what we're trying to do in the draft amendment to 17065 is we're trying to alter the definitions in 17065 so that whenever we use the term third party, we are consistent with ISO IEC 17000, and we use it as a descriptor of types of activities, and not implying that third party is some sort of requirement that the certification body has to meet. Now, that does not mean that 17065 is not going to require certification bodies to be separate and have separate, be impartial and not be impacted by other entities and their interests. Oh, no, not at all. 17065 will certainly continue to require that, but that's already in place. That's in the requirements in 4.1.2. in the certification agreement. That helps ensure the impartiality of the certification body and protect its inappropriate relationships with others, like the producer of the product or a user of the certification. And as well, 4.2 in 17065 already provides us requirements for how a certification body can or cannot be related to other organizations. So we don't need this undefined, term third party to be some sort of implied requirement for a certification body to meet. We've already got all that covered in these clauses in 17065. So we're going to try to make that third party term in 17065 more consistent with how it's defined and used in 17,000, and then of course other CASCO standards which are undergoing revision. So we've got one kind of change was the reference documents. A second kind of change in the proposal that got approved was terms and definitions. And now really the most significant, although, I think I've pointed out the other changes are significant too, but probably the most significant change is our third type of change. And this has to do with the clause of preventive action, 8.8 in the current 17065. We all recognize that that's part of the section on management system requirements in 17065. And the proposal, the draft amendment proposal, which was approved, indicated that we would replace the section 8.8 requirements for preventive action, and instead we would add actions to address risks and opportunities. Now, for those of you who are active in a variety of ISO CASCO standards, you recognize that this preventive action clause, which has appeared in all the CASCO standards, is being replaced in all the other CASCO standards as those standards are being revised. And it's and in all the other CASCO standards, the preventive action section is being replaced by a section on actions to address risks and opportunities. And the reason for this is historically, the ISO CASCO standards have always attempted to be a set of requirements that would be compatible and usable for an organization that wants to meet the ISO CASCO standard and also wants to meet an ISO management system standard. So as the ISO management system standards change, the ISO CASCO revisions kind of look at those management system standard changes. And the question that runs through our mind is, okay, so what do we need to do, if anything, to our ISO CASCO standard so that ours are compatible, so that an organization doesn't face any unnecessary burdens or complexities if they want to fulfill both an ISO management system standard and these ISO CASCO standards. And so the preventive action section used to be an element or a clause in previous versions of ISO management system standards. And those have been replaced, those are going away. And they're in the management system standards, they're being replaced by a clause called, you guessed it, actions to address risks and opportunities. So ISO CASCO is still going through this ongoing compatibility exercise. And so we want to try to make sure our standards are usable and compatible for those folks who are going to use both ISO CASCO and ISO management system standards. Now, however, we must recognize that making the standards, the ISO CASCO standards, compatible for organizations that also want to use ISO management system standards, that does not mean that ISO CASCO standards are ISO management system standards. It's very clear that they are not. If anyone chooses to read the rules, the standardized terminology, and the harmonized structure that ISO rules for management system standards lay down, if you read those, you will recognize that none of those are used in ISO CASCO standards. So ISO CASCO standards are not management system standards. Well, what is the implication for that regarding this change to preventive action? Well, the implication, and this is my personal opinion, it seems to me the implication here is that when you look closely at how the ISO management system standards set requirements for risks and opportunities, or actions to address risks and opportunities, you discover that that requirement in an ISO management system standard is playing a significantly different role within the management system standard than what we do here in an ISO CASCO standard. Okay, as a matter of fact, when you look at how the actions to address risks and opportunities fit in with the overall ISO management system standard, you see that particular concept isn't really even logical to apply to an ISO CASCO standard. And I'll invite you to submit questions about that if we want to talk in a lot more detail, but let me cover it just generally here. The result has been that other ISO CASCO standards that have been revised and have included requirements for actions to address risks and opportunities, those ISO CASCO standards borrowed some of the requirements text from the management system standards. But the text in the management system standard was talking about a different kind of activity for a different purpose. Using that text in an ISO CASCO standard, where actions to address risks and opportunities, which I believe means something significantly different, that's created some problems. I know of a number of different folks who have indicated that they get to those parts of the new ISO CASCO standards on actions to address risks and opportunities, and they run into some confusion, and really it's not clear to them what those requirements mean and what they're driving at. So in 17065, what we are doing is we are going to try to take a different approach for these requirements for actions to address risks and opportunities. So let me describe that approach. Here in 17065, we recognize that actions to address risks and opportunities are part of the management system requirements. Okay, they're not in the impartiality requirements, they're not in the personnel competence requirements, they're not in the legal entity. Nope, they're in the management system part of the standard. And the purpose of the management system requirements in an ISO standard is to create a set of requirements which, when fulfilled, causes the certification body in 17065 to self-govern and self-protect its own competence, consistency, and impartiality. In other words, to create a set of requirements by which the certification body self-controls its fulfillment of all the other requirements in 17065. The other requirements in 17065, as we all know, they deal in detail with what is going to be necessary for a certification body to be competent. Many requirements about that. There are lots of requirements about what a certification body needs to do to be impartial. And the reference to the scheme in 17065 certainly contribute to what a certification body needs to do to be consistent. And those requirements in clauses 4 through 7 in 17065, those are the clauses that are intended to provide assurance that a certification body is competent, consistent, and impartial. Those are the requirements that are intended to remove the effects of uncertainty about whether a certification body is competent, consistent, or impartial. And some of you will recognize that I emphasized remove the effects of uncertainty. I emphasize those words because that's the definition of what in ISO? It's the definition of risk. So the body of 17065 in clauses 4 through 7 is all about requirements to resolve the risks to competence, consistency, and impartiality. When you meet those requirements, what we say as the authors of the standard is these are effective requirements. When you meet them with the right intent, You can give people assurance that you are competent, consistent, and impartial, and you can take away the effects of uncertainty about people not being assured about that. So that is a different approach then, right, to risk in an ISO management system standard. And so let me give you an example, and I want you to imagine an imaginary standard to make this point clear about how ISO CASCO standards deal with risk and so forth. I want you to imagine a standard, any standard, ISO standard, a CEN standard, whatever standard body. It's a standard for how to freeze food and how to keep that food frozen. Okay, and in the body of that standard, we see lots of requirements that talk about how to prepare the food. We see lots of requirements about the process to actually freeze the food so that it's done to maintain the sanitation and all that good stuff, but that's effective to actually cause the food to be frozen effectively. And then we see a lot of requirements about how to maintain the frozen food, the facilities, the equipment, the backups to the power supplies that power the refrigeration equipment, and the monitoring and the record keeping and all kinds of requirements, so that when all these requirements are met, the organization that freezes and stores frozen food and the people who rely on that frozen food, they are all highly assured that the food has been frozen properly and has been maintained as frozen. And so as an organization, we work through all these requirements, right? And we invest and we create procedures and we buy equipment and we develop our processes and we go and we achieve complete and thorough fulfillment of all these requirements. And so we think we are in good shape. We can assure ourselves, we can assure others that we are effectively going to be able to freeze food and keep it frozen. But then we get to the last part of the standard. And the last part of the standard says, okay, now that you've done all that, now the requirement is you have to assess and identify and address your risks when you freeze food. And your reaction is probably going to be, well, I thought that's just what I got done doing. I thought that by fulfilling all these requirements that are very robust and thorough and developed by a consensus of experts, I thought if I fulfilled all those requirements, I thought I was addressing the risks, the effects of uncertainty about freezing food and keeping food frozen. I don't understand this requirement. Why do I have to go back and now address risks to freezing food and keeping it frozen when I've just fulfilled all the requirements in this standard? I'm very confused, as you should be. That requirement kind of doesn't make very much sense. And yet, it's a perfectly legitimate requirement in that context in a management system standard. If it was a management system standard for freezing and maintaining frozen food, it would make perfect sense. But in a requirement standard, in a standard that actually sets requirements for doing the activity specifically, then it doesn't quite jive. And to me, that's what's happened by borrowing these ISO management system requirements on actions to address risks actions to address risks and opportunities by pulling those management system standards into ISO CASCO standards. Because ISO CASCO standards, like as I mentioned, 17065 in particular, goes through explicit requirements on how to take away the uncertainty of whether you are competent, consistent, and impartial. You take away that uncertainty, you address that risk by meeting the requirements in the CASCO standard, sections 4 through 7. So when you get to the management system section in an ISO CASCO standard, and it says, okay, now take actions to address risks and opportunities, it's a little confusing. Because at first you're thinking, well, I don't think they mean risks to competence, consistency, and impartiality. I don't think that's what they mean, because I just got done doing that. By meeting all the very detailed and robust requirements in the CASCO standard, I've addressed my risk to competence, consistency, and impartiality. So if that's not what they're talking about, what is? Well, the other ISO CASCO standards don't really provide much of a clue about the answer to that question. But the draft amendment to 17065 does. And this is where it's different. In 17065, the draft amendment that was just balloted, the wording that was proposed for actions to address risks and opportunities were the risks and opportunities related to the effectiveness of the management system itself. So the requirements that were drafted in the draft amendment were obligating the certification body to consider, identify the risks to the effectiveness of the management system, the effectiveness of how well that management system would assure fulfillment of 17065 on an ongoing basis, the effectiveness of the self-control that the management system is supposed to be delivering. So why does this make sense? Well, first, risks are events or changed conditions that make the effectiveness of the management system less certain. That makes sense. That aspect of requirements for a certification body has not been addressed in any other clause in 17065. You won't find anything else in 17065 that sets requirements for taking away the uncertainty, the effects of uncertainty, the risks that would impact the effectiveness of the management system. So we're not confusing the reader by stating a requirement that sounds and looks like something that's already been addressed in the previous sections. And the same for opportunities. The way we drafted the draft amendment text, it makes it clear that the requirement is that the certification body is required to identify changes or events that will actually make it easier or better for the management system to exercise this self-control over ongoing fulfillment of the 17065 requirements. And then there's another requirement that says take actions to address the risks and opportunities. And there's one requirement that says if you take, when you take actions to address risk, the effect of uncertainty, then the actions you take shall be proportionate to the amount of uncertainty that you're related to. Now, why is this better? Well, first, it's clear. It's not vague about what kinds of risks and opportunities you're supposed to be addressing. So it's very clear, and so everybody can agree that that's what the requirements pertain to. Another reason it's better, in my opinion, is because it reinforces the purpose of the management system requirements in these ISO CASCO standards. It reinforces the fact that the management system is there so the body itself governs, monitors, maintains, controls its competence, consistency, and impartiality through fulfillment of the requirements in the standards. So it also drives and introduces some very clear accountability for the effectiveness of the management system. And let's be candid. Some organizations, when they first open a standard and take the actions and develop fulfillment of a standard, they'll put all the pieces in place to fulfill those management system requirements, and without maybe a clear understanding of why they're doing that or what it's supposed to accomplish, because the standard is not very clear and explicit in that regard. And so they may do that, but with this new requirement, the new requirement goes on to tell them it's not enough just to set up a management system. You have to think about its effectiveness. And you have to be sensitive to risks and opportunities related to that effectiveness. I think that sets a higher bar and a greater focus on the reason the management system is there and the responsibility of those who are responsible for the management system and its effectiveness. And of course, as I started, it's much clearer than the very vague kinds of requirements we see in other CASCO standards, where we see requirements for risks and opportunities, but those words, that requirements text, never tell you risks or opportunities related to what. They just say you shall address risks and opportunities, and it's unknown what those risks or opportunities pertain to. So hopefully this draft amendment text, whatever it ends up being, because we're just at our first ballot here, whatever it ends up being, hopefully it'll be clearer. Hopefully it'll make sense. It'll reinforce the reason and the effectiveness of management systems and product certification bodies. And if it does that, then perhaps it'll be a model for others to follow when other CASCO standards are revised. Now, here is the ballot that shows us the results of that draft amendment that was balloted out to CASCO members. Here you can see how many approval votes were got, how many disapproved votes the ballot got, the breakdown of the region, and obviously you're thinking that Keith has lost his mind and he's probably not looking at the same slide I'm looking at because there are no numbers here. But no, you are correct. There are no numbers here. I'm still waiting for the numbers, as we all are. The ballot for the draft amendment closed on October 28th. I think it was just about 3 weeks ago to the day, or a little bit more than 3 weeks ago. But as of yet, we haven't seen the actual results. So unfortunately, I can't share with you the numbers. Maybe we'll be able to do that on another webinar that we have on this draft amendment in the future. I will say that that based on the nature of what we're doing, keep in mind that the draft amendment proposal was very specific about the types of things we were going to change. Based on that, and based on the nature of most of the changes being pretty common sense, especially in terms of reference documents and terms and definitions. And finally, acknowledging that CASCO ballots almost always pass, one can speculate that it might be approved. Do we know? No, we don't know. We have to wait and see the final results. But to answer the question of what happens next, we're going to make the assumption that this draft amendment ballot that closed October 28th, we're going to assume that that ballot gets approved. Because if the ballot is not approved, if a majority of CASCO members vote to disapprove the specific draft amendment that we as the working group created, well, then what happens next is pretty obvious, isn't it? What happens next is, well, we didn't do a very good job as a working group. We completely missed the boat on what we thought the CASCO members would want to see in an amendment to 17065 in accordance with the proposal. And so if it's not approved, we have to go back and do a lot of work. We have to kind of start over, if you will. So but for this purposes, let's assume that the amendment is approved. So what are the two paths that can be followed? Well, if the amendment is approved, then the next thing the working group is going to do, of course, is we're going to have to deal with all the comments that were submitted during the ballot of this draft amendment. And in our resolution of those comments, one of two things will happen. In order to resolve the comments per the consensus of the working group, if we have to make technical changes to the draft amendment text, and keep in mind, we're not talking about changing 17065. This is a ballot about the amendment text that we have written up. If we have to make technical changes to that draft amendment text in order to resolve comments, then we are obligated. We have to then issue a final draft amendment ballot back to ISO CASCO members. No choice, and so there would be another ballot of a final draft amendment for ISO CASCO members to approve if we make technical changes. Now, if we can resolve the comments from this ballot and do so in a way where we don't need to make technical changes, there may be editorial changes, there may be some style changes, or some improved wording, but the meaning, the real technical meaning of what the draft amendments that got balloted doesn't change. Well, now we have a choice. We can choose to go to a final draft amendment ballot if we think even our non-technical changes are significant, that we want the CASCO member bodies to have one last look at them. Or we do have the option, and this is a judgment, it's made primarily by the leaders of the working group, but with conversation with the working group members, we do have the option to go straight to publication, so that the draft amendment that just got balloted is the last draft, and the next thing that we would all see would be the publication of the amendment to 17065. So at some point, however, regardless of which path we take, final draft amendment or straight to publication, in either case, presumably, we are going to get to the point when our work is completed and we have completed our amendment to 17065. What does that look like? Well, again, there are two choices here. So before I describe the two choices, just to summarize, the draft amendment that was balloted, I beg your pardon, that was balloted here this past fall, addressed 34 different clauses within 17065. There was some sort of wording change to 34 different clauses in 17065 in this draft amendment. Now, when the draft amendment is finally ready for publication, there are two paths that can be followed. The first is the draft amendment itself, the specific changes to each of these individual clauses that can be published as a standalone, independent, separate document. So in that path, if you wanted to use 17065 as amended, you would hold in one hand your copy of 17065 edition 2012. You would hold in your other hand the published amendments to 17065. And in order to use or apply 17065, you would have to read the clause in 17065 in your one hand, then go check the amendments that you're holding in your other hand to see if that wording has changed. And if it has, what is that change, and what does that change make the 17065 clause look like now? Now, I use 17065 pretty regularly, and to me, that path, that idea of having to have two documents every time I want to understand or apply something from 17065 sounds complicated and sounds burdensome. That's my particular take on it. I would not be a happy person if I had to do that, especially if there's 34 different clauses in 17065 that have been revised. And that's because that's a lot. That means every time I read any clause in 17065, I have to go back to the amendment document to see, am I reading a clause that changed, or is this a clause that didn't change? Anyway, for me personally, I don't know. That doesn't sound good to me. The other path that's available is that instead of publishing a separate independent draft amendment document at the end of the process, ISO could take the path of combining the current 17065 and the amendments that have been approved by ISO CASCO, combining them and then publishing a new edition of 17065 with the draft amendments built in, so that you would only have one document. Now, for me, that sounds much, much better. That sounds like a tool that it would be much easier for me to use. How is that decision going to be made? Well, it's the ISO CASCO members will vote on that, and that will be voted on at the next at the stage where the draft amendment, the draft amendment is ready to go to publication. So the CASCO members will make that decision, and we'll see how that turns out. Now, regardless of which path is chosen, an amendment does not change the systematic review date for the document. So regardless of when the amendment is published or the nature of how that amendment is published, 2029 will be the next systematic review of 17065. That is really what I wanted to cover with you today. I hope this has been helpful. I hope you've enjoyed it. And I'm going to take a brief break here and get a drink of water, and then I'll be back to answer your questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Keith. We have a few more minutes left for questions. So if you have any questions for Keith, you can go ahead and put them in the Q&A box. While we let you enter your questions, I'm just going to go over some additional resources that we have available to you. ANAB has many different media to further your understanding of standards, accreditation, management systems, and assessments. On our website, we have free webcasts on a variety of topics. They're between 5 and 20 minutes each, depending on the topic, and you can view them at any time. We also have a blog page that has information related to risk, accreditation, standard requirements, and many other topics. We do these webinars monthly. This is actually our second webinar in November. Our next webinar is early December on data integrity. Finally, we offer training in many different areas, including internal auditing, standard overviews, risk, and other topics. Most of our open registration courses are live online. We are offering in-person training in January in conjunction with the ANAB Conformity Assessment Symposium, and you can get more information about that on our website at anab.ansi.org. Now we'll get to your questions. Keith, we had 2 questions come in so far. The first one is, would an example of risk in this context be the unexpected departure of the member of management assigned responsibility for the 2 items in 8.2.3?
That's a great question. I don't have 8.2.3 in front of me, but I don't think I even actually need to see that to answer the question. Yes, I think the answer to that is clearly yes. So if I'm a certification body and I have a key member of my team, and they have a responsibility for a part of the management system that I'm required to operate in accordance with 17065 requirements, and that person leaves for good or bad reasons, it doesn't matter, but now they're gone. To me, that is a significant source of uncertainty regarding the effectiveness of my management system. That person had responsibility and played a role in the effectiveness of the management system, and now they're not here. Now I have less certainty. I don't know what the impact of that is going to be. That, by definition, in ISO is risk. It's an effect of uncertainty. The risk is the effect of uncertainty that happens because this person is no longer here. Now, in that scenario, in order to fulfill the requirement as stated in the draft amendment to 17065, one would expect that event to be flagged, identified, and that the certification body to take actions to address that uncertainty. So when the person leaves, the certification body would need to take action to identify, oh, well, now what's happening to the effectiveness of our management system? We don't know. How do we find out, right? And what actions are we going to do to get rid of that uncertainty of the effectiveness on our management system? And to me, that's a good thing. That's a requirement that's driving the right kind of activities and actions to make that certification body consistently competent and impartial and consistent in the eyes of its interested parties. Excellent question.
Right. Follow-up question to that one. Would an opportunity be consideration to implement an electronic record storage system to replace paper records?
Another good question. So let's look at it this way. Let's say the certification body, for business purposes or whatever purposes, is doing exactly what you say. They've had paper-based records for all these years, and now they have an opportunity to upgrade, and they're going to migrate over to an all electronic record storage system, right? Well, is that change? Is that something that could make the effectiveness of the management system easier or better? And I think the answer to that would be, it sure seems like that, doesn't it? And so that's a perfect example of an event or a change that this requirement in the draft amendment would obligate the certification body to pay attention to, right? First, be aware of. That's good. But more importantly, it would obligate the certification body to understand that it is an opportunity. And that alone is, I think, powerful and effective as a requirement to make sure that this management system that's there to achieve self-governance, self-control is actually working. So I think that's a great example of an opportunity that would be required for the certification body to recognize and potentially take actions to take advantage of under these new requirements.
All right, we've got less than a minute left, and we've got one more question. It says, what were the arguments for those opposed to and in favor of updating fully, and why was there less support outside of the US, China, Japan, et cetera?
Well, as I understood it, and I did read some of the comments, so on the original systematic review ballot back last year, there were a number of folks, or a number of countries, I should say, member bodies, who wanted to revise, right? And there were some sound reasons for that. Some said the document's 12 years old, and a 12-year-old document, with the way the world changes, we should just revise it. We don't really need a big particular reason why. Its age alone is enough, right? Others were citing some of these issues that the draft amendment has addressed. The terminology, the reference documents that don't exist anymore, and so on and so forth. So those were some of the arguments on the let's revise the document side of that ballot, systematic review ballot. On the other side of the ledger, the people who voted to confirm, they didn't articulate a lot of reasons, and so we have to speculate a little bit on that. And I think I would speculate, from my own personal opinion, I would speculate it as the reason the people wanted to confirm the standard is because of the extent and the volume of its use. I think it's a very heavily used standard in an extremely broad number of industry sectors and geographic locations. And so a change to the standard that affects that many sectors and that many geographies and that many industries, the change necessarily is going to carry a cost that gets magnified and multiplied by the breadth of its use. And that's something that I think people were paying attention to. And so in order to justify the impact on that broad of a set of users, my gut was telling me that some member countries were weighing, okay, how much do we really need to change in 17065 so it's effective, versus look at how many people this is going to impact if we just open the whole thing up for a revision. And my gut was telling me that they reached a decision point that said, yeah, maybe it could be improved, but it doesn't justify the cost of impacting this broad a number of stakeholders and industries and certification bodies, et cetera, et cetera. I say that because that's a theory. It's speculative on my part. The ballot results for the draft amendment would tend to support that theory. I can tell you that the folks who voted against the draft amendment proposal, I believe, as I recall, their primary reason was this is not appropriate. We just had a systematic review ballot where it was not open for revision. It's not appropriate. This is not the right time to decide whether to do an amendment to the standard. But apparently that was a relatively, small minority that felt that, who decided to express it. I hope that answers the question.
Great. Thank you so much, Keith. Thank you, everyone, for attending our webinar today. I will leave it at our contact information slide if you have questions about training that ANAB offers, or about accreditation services, or additional questions for Keith after this webinar is posted online. You can email either of the email addresses here on the slide. Thank you all very much. Have a great rest of your day.